Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation around the Hulu's documentary, I Am Greta, moderated by IndieWire's Kristen Lopez. We're super excited to have you all. Before we begin, I'm going to start by introducing myself. You've all seen me now, I think, for a few months, but my name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Public Programs and Events Manager here at the International Documentary Association. I'm coming to you today from Los Angeles on the unceded land of the Tongva and Chumash people who have been stewards of this land for generations. I would like to first offer some thanks to our sponsors. We couldn't do this without support from IndieWire. So thank you very much. And we also have support from KCRW. We're getting to the tail end of this screening series, but we still have a lot of amazing films and conversations ahead. So you can go to our website, documentary.org/screening series to see that list of upcoming films and conversations. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Kristen Lopez from IndieWire to get this conversation started.
Hi, everybody. It is so great to get to be here to talk about this fantastic documentary. I'm Kristen Lopez. I'm the TV editor at IndieWire. I'm also a film critic and pop culture essayist. And we all get to share a couple minutes talking about the climate and an amazing young woman who I am just jealous of, is super cool. Every time I get to hear about her and talk about her. We're talking about I Am Greta today, and I am so thrilled to get to sit down with the documentary's director and cinematographer, Nathan Grossman. Hi, Nathan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to get to sit down and talk with you about Greta today.
Yes, it feels like every time I talk about this movie, there's always something new coming up, and it's so lovely also because I've been doing, of course, lots of Q&As and interviews. But what's so fantastic with her story, of course, is that everyone in different parts of the world have different kind of views. So it's always interesting discussing it.
Exactly. Well, I guess that leads into the first question, which is the background question. How did you first hear about Greta, and how did that translate into wanting to tell her story?
And like many documentaries, this started with a tip. A friend of mine that knew Greta's family a little bit gave me a tip that she was going to do some kind of a small manifestation outside the Swedish government. Which led up to me and my boss having like a discussion about if it was worth, doing a recce and checking it up. And I think that's where my kind of background comes in, as I'm not like an environmental filmmaker, but I've made films that at least are kind of in connection to environmental and climate topics before. And when you search for Greta, then she was not even in Sweden a known person, but I found this article by like a Swedish, actually conservative newspaper where she had done like an op-ed, and I read it and it was interesting, and it struck me that it would be interesting to at least give it like 1 or 2 days to see who she was, and to see like how a young person who will be so affected by climate change, how she kind of relates to the issue. So I packed my bags and went down to this tiny street, and that's kind of how it started.
Well, we've heard about the climate change issue for so long, and there have been other activists that have come out to talk about this, but Greta has become the name on everybody's lips. For you, what do you think stands out about how she approaches this topic? Is it just because she's young, or I would say this documentary shows there's a lot more to her than that, but what stands out to you about her activism?
No, but I think it was actually interesting because now this Christmas the movie is it's leaving cinemas and going to broadcast. So I just went through the subtitling again, and then it struck me when I looked at the Swedish subtitles, like, gee, she's so like like it's very like short. Like she's very on point, you know. Sometimes I get so jealous of her, you know, when I try to describe something, it comes out as, you know, long sentences, and she has this ability to kind of hit the core of something, I think, which comes to maybe not being so interested in all the chit chatting around an issue. And I think that has been a very large part of her kind of way of communicating this, that she has just gone to some of these key facts and key figures and repeated them, you know, and stayed true to them. And I think sometimes when it comes to the specific issue of climate change, maybe in all these fluffy kind of context, we sometimes have missed the core issues of it. That we know we don't have much time, not much is happening, you know. So I think sometimes her simplicity in that way has been very important, I think.
Well, this documentary is so intimate and expressive, and especially showing how Greta expresses herself. And you know, this being per IMDb, at least your documentary feature debut, and you're playing double duty as cinematographer. How did you want to approach telling her story in terms of style or narrative technique?
Yeah, I think in that sense, in this project, it was lucky that I have a background in cinematography. Luckily nowadays, or before this project, I had been working for a few years with cinematographers and kind of left that job a little bit. But starting with this, we didn't have much budget, and I was also felt that to be able to kind of not stop her activism and not intrude on it, it was easier if I didn't kind of bring a big team. So starting to shoot her, I was very close to her, you know, physically, because that's the thing as a cinematographer, you're always a little bit closer than the director. And more I got interested in how she kind of perceived this crazy year that was starting to take place, and this tumbling activism that just went quicker and quicker and quicker. And I was more and more interested in not like, how does she react to this? From her, you know, she's fairly short, from her eye level, as in Sweden and also abroad, the discussion was more and more kind of intellectualized, and it was more and more people it was more and more people, like external voices, that tried to frame her. And I think that's you know, seeing that intellectually, what was happening in the way that the media spoke about her, and at the same time being very physically close to her with the camera, I formed this idea of telling the story from her point of view, and really kind of trying to make a story where the viewer would spend 1.5 hours inside her head, kind of.
Well, to go off of that, what I was enthralled by especially is seeing how other people see her. You know, I think people forget the love, the reverence that people have, whether that's young teens or grown adults. We see her taking selfies. I mean, can you talk about your response seeing how others took her in?
Yeah, but it's of course, I think, special for any kind of filmmaker that has followed people from early on, and there's been this kind of very huge development, to see how the world is kind of changed. Like the world has changed their perspective of the person, but you still know this person, you know, as the same guy or girl or anything who you met in the beginning. And I think that was true for me, because I got to know her. You know, the first time I met her was down there on that street, and I got to know her in Sweden when she wasn't very famous, and it was more of kind of a small thing. So I always have had her, you know, I've never seen her as an icon. I've more seen her as, you know, a teenager. And then when you kind of travel to Europe, and you suddenly the Pope stands there and looks a bit, you know, smiley and happy that he gets to see this person, and you'd be like, but come on, this is, you know, this is just Greta, you know, this is just her. So I think for me, it's been, and I think some of that comes true in the film, in kind of that I never maybe have fully understood why people kind of idolize her so much. Actually, I've never understood why people idolize anyone like so much. But it becomes a bit interesting in a story like this, of course, when the topic is that we're talking about the future of humanity and this huge issue. And then I think it becomes even more important not to put that onto one kind of child's shoulders and to idolize her as the one who's going to save us in a sense.
One, what I was also struck by is you're dealing with so many complex themes with this documentary, and I think Greta's autism and the way she deals with that is so often lost in this conversation, or too often, emphasized, especially by her critics. And as somebody who is disabled, I think that the documentary shows it with such sensitivity. How did you want to approach that prior to filming, and how did you work with Greta during filming, especially as we see her kind of navigating some of the issues that stem from that?
No, but that's a really good question, Kristen, and I think it's kind of at the core of also why I kind of chose this point of view, because first of all, I don't think we as documentarians have, like, especially when we follow a person this closely, we need to think of kind of what rights do I have to tell this person's story? What rights do I have to interpret this person's whole existence? Because even if I say, I want to make a movie and that kind of shows how Greta sees the world, it's still my subjective, way of telling it. So for me, it was so important that first of all, she was very open with her diagnosis and didn't herself see it as this disability or an issue. She even had it on her Twitter profile from, I think, her first or second day on activism here in Sweden. It was, and I think still is actually there, this fantastic bio of 15, 16-year-old climate activist with Asperger's syndrome. So that kind of made me comfortable with that this was something that she really embraced. And then as well, filming her and when I moved into doing the interviews and that then formed the narration, it was actually hard kind of getting it out because she came back to it over and over again. If I asked her, okay, how was it? How did you interpret this situation? Or how was it meeting this person? She would always include some kind of reasoning about that's because I have Asperger's, or that's because I see the world in this way. So I felt that I had more kind of an obligation to really include that and to really help the viewer understand what that meant for her, because we need to remember that any diagnosis, and I think that's what some of her both critics and idols have forgotten, but Asperger's syndrome or autism, it's different for every person. It's so easy that we just make it like a simplified kind of umbrella for everyone that has that specific diagnosis. But of course, that's not the truth. And this movie shows how she kind of interprets her diagnosis and what it means for her.
Well, I love that you include that moment where she's sitting down for the interview and the person says, I know you suffer from this. And she responds with, I don't suffer from that. That just made me smile, because I think that that's so often, unless you're actually living with a diagnosis, people perceive it that way. So I was so happy that was included, and she got to kind of advocate for herself in that way. But what I also noticed that I appreciated so much, there's that moment where one of her critics is talking about how she's being exploited by her parents, and the relationship that she has with her family in this movie is so wonderfully depicted, especially her dad. What about their relationship did you want to highlight, especially as they're traveling on the road and they're spending so much time together, and those father-daughter moments of squabbling tend to come out? How did you want to approach that?
No, but that's also one of the things which is so interesting when you do a kind of both a verite movie, but also a film where you don't have, you're following activism that kind of is happening at the moment. So when I filmed, I didn't really know kind of what I really wanted to kind of include as you film, but I definitely remember the first time where I really got to kind of see the relationship between Greta and her father as the movie was turning more into a road movie and she was traveling more and more. I got the opportunity to follow with and asked her if I could join for a trip. And I remember sitting in the back seat of the car, and it was this special moment where it's a little bit like when you're young and you get to travel with a friend, and that's, the moment where you sit in the car together with the family, and you kind of, okay, so that's him and that's her and that's the relationship between them. And I had that moment in the car where I had to kind of bite my lip not to laugh, because it was so kind of recognizable and so teenage father kind of relationship funny. And from that moment, I at least knew that this thread of narrative I really want to include, because I think both, of course, it's funny and it gives a lot of insight into something that everyone kind of can recognize themselves in. But I also think it's such an important thing, because Greta has been open about that she comes from like fairly privileged family and upper middle class Swedish, world. But it's one thing saying that in interviews, and it's something else showing it in kind of in the scenes that she is kind of, she comes from that privilege, and I think she wouldn't have been able to do this activism if that wasn't kind of how it was. And so I wanted to be truthful and show that.
Well, of course, capturing family dynamics and doing that verite style, were there conversations between her and her father and her mother and you in terms of striking a balance between this is private family time versus this is for the documentary? Were there moments like that?
No, not in detail, but I think it comes naturally in the sense that as I got to know them, I could present my kind of idea of how I make movies, which is that I need to be able to take my kind of point of view of it. Otherwise, it's impossible for me to tell the story. But what I could say to Greta was that in the end, you can come in and you can look at the film when I have compiled my story, when I'm practically done and happy with what I'm doing. You can have a look at it and you can say if there's something that you totally don't recognize with this portrayal. If you think I've perceived something totally from how it was. So I could give that opportunity to her, which she of course took and watched the film in the late process. And in that stage, she didn't have anything that she wanted to remove, but because she said that she recognized herself so much in the portrayal and felt that it was much more nerdy and kind of, how do you say, three-dimensional than what she was used to. But of course, coming just back to the thing about the kind of private situations and so on, of course, you as a filmmaker, you have contact with your subject, and if there's like, someone has you have a birthday party, and you'd be like, okay, cool, would you like me to come, or could I come and film? And they would be like more like, if you really need it, but of course it's nice for us to have a birthday on our own. And then you'd be like, okay, but I don't need a birthday, and you can form that more natural, I think. But I was never kind of shut out in any way, which I was both happy and a little bit surprised that they were so open.
Well, there's a scene in the documentary that broke my heart, but it's so real and authentic to what Greta is speaking about. It's the moment where she's watching videos and it's all the negative press that is often playing on her being a female and her being autistic. Why was it so important to document that moment? And can you speak about that day and filming it?
Yeah, I think that day was actually after she met the Pope, I think. And I had been interested because the criticism towards her, and as you say, very much coming from the point of her being young, being female, being on the spectrum, had been kind of going around for a long time. And I wasn't, and I didn't want to kind of force that onto a subject. Forcing that person to kind of read or look at that kind of imagery if that person didn't want it. So I didn't really know how she felt around this weird kind of criticism. And then suddenly I think she read some article or something on a Swedish newspaper, and she just went to the comment field and she started this kind of live commentary of those comments, and it just felt like a very natural way and a very kind of a genuine reaction in that moment, and that was probably the only thing I really captured with her being in contact with the criticism, and I felt that it was, you know, it was telling enough for us in the kind of editing to kind of settle for that, and also when I had done interviews with her, I've also had asked her about the criticism, and those kind of answers around those questions form like a voiceover, and I felt like that together made like a package which I think was told what I needed.
Well, and I think it also speaks to, so often activists or really anybody in the public eye are perceived as that their job first and a person second. And we're adding another layer on to her with her being a teenager. And this documentary tries so hard to capture the girl as well as the activist. Can you discuss wanting to showcase those moments of her just being a teenager, and why that was so necessary to kind of turn her away from being a monolith into a human?
Yeah, I think that's also kind of a key part of this process for me, in the sense that we tend to see anyone who becomes like a public figure very much as like they tend to be fairly one-dimensional in the media, because, you know, we don't have that much space and characters to describe everyone in the news all the time, and therefore I wanted to kind of include the layers that was more kind of teenager-ish, because I think those juxtaposed very well towards this kind of almost a bit stoic and one-dimensional picture that people had of her. So then the balance became a very important thing in the kind of editing, how we could balance the public person and the kind of private person, so that felt truthful, because she is of course both of these things. She is of course this stoic and angry girl, which is portrayed in the media, so that part of her also needs to be a part of the kind of portrayal, and also for the film to work for a wide audience, and for some and lots of audience that we've tested it on haven't had that much knowledge about Greta actually, and, you know, we had to see that they could kind of understand her story, so including the public figure became important for that story, and then juxtaposing with those kind of moments of sincere teenagerish dancing, you know, laughing at your father. And I think it says, I don't know, I think it's a little bit Scandinavian in the sense that we we love to kind of to kind of make our, you know, we call it diskbänksrealism in Swedish, which I think would be translated to kind of to like at home boringness reality. It's like we love to portray our leaders and you know, to make them human, to understand that they're actually just like you and me in a sense.
Well, to go off of that, is there something that stands out to you that audiences did not know about Greta before this, that you're happy that you were able to capture on film, that shows a different side of her?
Yeah, but I think that I'm very happy, at least from the reactions that that I've kind of been in contact with, how surprised people have been that she's so funny, and that she's so kind of ordinary in some ways. That those kinds of moments of just kind of bubbly teenager in a sense. I think that's even in Sweden, where she's so heavily covered. We are actually, it's weird. Like, we had so good reviews in Sweden, which I thought would be not very good, because here we've covered her so heavily, but people were so surprised and so fascinated by those sides of her, and that kind of more personal teenage side of her. And I'm very happy that people got to know that, because I think it humanizes her, and I think that's something we need to do, not just with her, but actually with lots of people in the public kind of sphere.
Well, there's the big third act boat trip to New York that we see, that just looks utterly harrowing for me. You know, for you, what were the logistical and emotional hurdles, not just for Greta, but for you documenting that boat trip?
Sure, but there were so many, so it's like even hard to cover. But I would say, in short, first of all, it was the question of if I would even join on the trip, because I think there you have a certain responsibility in the sense of kind of, okay, is this safe? And if not safe, if I like, I don't want to be the anyone who kind of persuades anyone to do this. So that was important. It came from her, and I talked to the captain after, it felt that they had already settled and discussed with him more like, okay, what are, like, how is this going to be done, and how hard is this, and maybe found out that this would be, of course, strange, like a bumpy ride, but not necessarily dangerous. And from that point, I felt like, okay, I can kind of join and document it under those kind of premises. But then, of course, there were the logistics, just of understanding how to capture one of these kind of boat rides, because this is not a place where you, like, I've actually seen some footage from before we went from these kinds of boats, and I was surprised, like, but there's nothing. What is this? Like, why aren't there any cinematic shots? And we did like lots of research, talking to other filmmakers, like specialized cinematographers that had gone on these boats, and they were just laughing towards me, and we're like, oh, no, you can't, you're happy if you get just one stable shot. So I think I spent like a month just preparing, like, technically and from a story point of view, like, what can I capture on this trip, because it won't be as much as we dream of, because of the technical kind of boundaries of how a boat like this works. So it was a lot of preparing.
Well, we see Greta kind of deal with the isolation and the cabin fever, so to speak. Did that hit you at a certain point during the boat trip?
Yeah, definitely. What is actually interesting is that I was the one who had most kind of cabin fever and nausea, and I was battling the trip. I think even more than Greta, and one of the captains was also like more seasick, and he had a really hard time eating practically during that entire boat ride, because he didn't really get into it. So it says a lot about how heavy this could be, and that you don't really know who kind of tackles it best. And of course, it was so tough for us in the beginning, and it was tough for me seeing how Greta and everyone on the boat were kind of trying to get into this very weird place. But and of course, though most of the kind of imagery that we use in the film are from that part of the journey. But then I think Greta settled in fairly well, and I think to one actually degree, and she's also talked about that afterwards, that she became kind of relaxed in the sense of knowing that, you don't have any Twitter or Instagram, or and she had been in this crazy, activism bubble for a long time, and I think it was also a little bit relaxing for her when she got into the sailing ride. As for me and the other captain, who was more kind of seasick, we never really went into it. So I think we never had that kind of relaxation. We just battled.
Well, knowing Greta's commitment to eliminating waste and the things that she does in her day to day to limit her footprint, so to speak, did that affect the filmmaking crew? And you just documenting her. Did you make efforts, as you were doing this, to limit your, I guess, carbon footprint, or did her activism rub off on you while doing this?
Yeah, but of course, in this specific project, it was easy because it was just me. So it was that easier making a documentary with a very low carbon footprint. Um, but I decided to travel as she did. So when I went on the trips with her, I went by electric car and by train. And of course, sometimes you film 1 or 2 days, and her activism continues. And I had to go back to Sweden, and then I took the train back as well, and because I started to get kind of used to it and felt truthful for the story and so on. So it was fairly easy to adapt to that kind of way of doing this story. And also, I think to some extent I've kind of learned a lot. I was definitely interested in this topic before, and I had kind of a great kind of fundamental, probably a little bit above average knowledge, but I was surprised by how many details I didn't know of, and how simplified maybe I sometimes thought it was, in the sense that I thought that some, small decisions made by you as a person could be kind of enough, but understanding kind of how systemic some of the issues were, and also understanding how these figures presented in these UN reports that she keeps on referring to, how kind of really grim they look like when you really kind of go into the chart and look at it, which I maybe haven't done that much. I've probably read more of the kind of news takedowns of it, and those kind of more journalistic pieces. So I definitely learned a lot, and I think nowadays I'm at least a little bit more concerned, and I think more actively with kind of, I used to say that I have this kind of Greta layer sometimes on my glasses, which means that when a situation kind of comes up, I tend to think, okay, but like if we're going to buy like a new laptop to do this project, like it's like there's lots of like resources and metals, and do we really need that laptop? And you kind of ask that question to the tech guy once again, like, do you really need it, or could you do it with the old one? And he's like, it's not that much of a difference. And I think being more active in that sense is something that has come after this film.
Well, and you mentioned it, in your answer just now, that I think so many people assume that this climate change issue is so overwhelming and it's so big. For you doing this documentary, what is the biggest misconception about climate change that you've discovered, and how did Greta simplify it for you, I guess?
Great question. Geez, it's so funny. I love these Q&As because she always comes up great questions that you haven't heard. No, but I think sadly, the biggest misconception is that technology will save us, I think. And that doesn't mean that technology won't be needed. And when I say technology, I mean every like carbon capture, when you try to suck down carbon, and electric cars and everything, that it's fantastic. But the idea of that saving everything, I think that's a big misconception that I think many people carry, which kind of keeps the status quo. And maybe that's a big part of why we've discussed this issue for such a long time, and we haven't seen the changes in the emission patterns, and we haven't seen the behavioral changes, because I think people are so receptive to, if you hear or you just read like a news story about, someone has come up with a new way of capturing carbon, and then you'd be like, oh, solved. Or you read this small kind of, you see a video on Vice or whatever that now they can make aero fuel, like fuel for airplanes, but from trees. And then you'd be like, okay, well, let's book a flight to Bahamas. And it's of course, those things are so they're so small kind of progressions, and even if they would be scaled up, they're going to be fantastic, but they're not going to save us in that sense. And that's, I think, a big misconception.
Well, with that, in watching the documentary, I think it galvanizes the audience to do something. And I think one of the things people always say is, well, I don't know where to start. For you doing this project and working with Greta, what are some of the simplest things people can do if they're inspired by her story and want to do more?
No, but I think it's so interesting because, Greta took the sabbatical year. And in the film, she also says, that she really, it was so hard for her because she really loved studying, she really, and that's something I have noticed of her. If she gets the possibility, she loves to study something. And I think if you want to kind of do something in the kind of agenda of Greta, of course, start with kind of reading up. Start by kind of, when you see that article about carbon capture, read up on that technology and go to the sources, and try to spend those few extra minutes on on being interested in the subject. And the same with the reports when it comes new reports from the UN, some of those landmark, which comes maybe 1 or 2 times a year from the IPCC, their kind of intergovernmental panel on climate change. But spend 10, 15 minutes, go to that report, read it. I think that's a really good starting point. And then from that point, it's much, much easier to understand what you can do with your activism or what you can do with your own consumption habits or whatever. But I think go try to be interested in the facts of it.
Well, the last question I wanted to throw out is, obviously COVID has kind of been on the forefront of everybody's minds, but we know that Greta does not stop, that she's still very, determined in her activism. How has she been balancing her activism and keeping herself safe, and talking about this documentary? And what is your hope for the climate crisis once COVID and with the election and all of that is kind of hopefully in the rear view?
No, but I think in that sense, as she took this one sabbatical year, which is to have covered in the movie, I think the timing was in that sense good, because she was going back to Sweden, and she was, she started high school, her first high school year now in the end of this summer. So in that sense, that was also the time when the pandemic really started to become a big problem in Europe. And so in that sense, I think it was, she in any case, she would have had to spend time starting to focus a little bit more on that. But I think what has been interested in following her and the kind of young kind of climate strike movement during this pandemic time is it comes to the word of crisis, I think, that you mentioned, which is such an interesting word. Because I remember sitting in the editing with my fantastic editors and my story developer, and Greta used to say this sentence, treat the crisis as a crisis. It was something that came up a lot. And I remember we had these really interesting discussions kind of editorially where we didn't really understand what that meant. And we were like, maybe we should take it out of the film, or we need to have context because this doesn't mean anything. And then in the editing, this crisis of, COVID struck. And suddenly we had this reference point of like, oh, okay, so this is what she means. This is what she means. She means that everyone should focus on this solely. She means that the political leaders should seriously have, they should fund the problem. They should do whatever they can. They should talk about it as a crisis. Okay, so this is the reaction that could mean a change for the climate. And I think now with COVID, which is a disastrous health crisis, and it's really a crisis, but I think it also gives us a reference point towards how the climate crisis, which is actually even bigger when it comes to long term, is something that needs to be addressed in this way. And I think it's going to be very hard telling these young people that we cannot, be alarmistic, or we cannot do whatever we, can. There are no money when you come out of this crisis where you've shown that there is political will and there is money, and we can do something.
I was muted. Greta, I think, definitely inspires all of us to do more. And I know that she's infinitely cooler than I will ever be. So I'm so excited that I got to talk to you about her today. I Am Greta is available to stream on Hulu, and you can watch it now. I hope everybody takes it in and gets the message and just idolizes Greta, because I do. But Nathan, thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me today. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you for great questions. And I hope that the audience will get some new perspectives to the film and to Greta's activism.
Exactly. And thank you to everybody watching along with us.